Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you with us again. Well, that's presumptuous. Maybe this is the first time. So maybe there is no again. Maybe this is like you saw this sort of advertisement or some sort of link for the pubcast and you thought, that is weird. What are those guys about? Well, if that's you, let's introduce ourselves. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church here in the Pacific Northwest, right outside of Portland. And I've written some books. In fact, I just saw the cover for my new book on Bombadil, and I'm sharing that in different platforms, and people seem to like it a lot, so I'm very pleased about that. I'm told that book will be out in early November. So that's that. I've done some other things. I've been a professor of philosophy. I've been a real estate investor, yada, yada, yada. Enough about me. How about you, Tom? Tell everybody about yourself.
Tom Price. I teach systematic theology, teach Christian ethics, philosophy at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and other places. Working on a book right now. It's kind of a bridge between Christian theology and evangelical metaphysics of creation and ethics as they relate to issues that are raised with the ever-increasing technological world. So that's fun, and that's forthcoming.
All right, great. Glenn.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm Professor Emeritus of History at Central Connecticut State University, Senior Fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, Ministry Associate with Reflections Ministries, and a few other things.
All right, great. Well, it's my day today. So, as I was thinking about what could we talk about, it occurred to me that there was something in a book that I just finished up that I thought would be a great topic for discussion. I'm a real, I guess, fanboy. Maybe that's the way to say it. Maybe just aficionado. Maybe just someone who appreciates this person. For Christopher Lasch. Now, Christopher Lasch, he was a pretty significant public intellectual in the last couple of decades of the 20th century. He died before the turn of the century, but he had a remarkably significant influence on me and the way I think. He's probably best known for a book he wrote that was published in the late 70s called The Culture of Narcissism. And I imagine that some folks who were actually alive in those days and were adults may have heard that title before. But anyway, Culture of Narcissism was sort of like his kind of coming out party in terms of his position as a public intellectual in the United States. He was a red diaper baby. He had grown up in a home that was very much on the left. His father, if I remember correctly, was an editor for the Chicago Tribune. But he went to Harvard. He was roommates with John Updike, Rabbit Run, and all those novels. So anyway, can you imagine those two guys down the hall from you at Harvard, and I imagine they had some late night conversations that were probably pretty fascinating. But he went on. I think he got his PhD at Columbia. And I think he taught at Columbia for a while. But then I think he was up in upstate New York in Rochester. I think that he's an historian. So he's someone in your discipline, Glenn. And he was a remarkably incisive thinker, and he was a great observer, sort of trends in American life and culture. And really, when it came to sort of his ability to sort of see the big picture and trace out developments and sort of trends in American culture and Western culture generally, he was tough to beat. But the thing that really intrigued me most about him is many of the best thinkers on the right, he was a repentant Marxist. So he, as I noted, was a red diaper baby, grew up in the left, that kind of thing. Then was sort of disaffected or disillusioned by what he saw on the left. He moved in a conservative direction, but never really fully sort of embraced I guess, neoliberalism or some of the things that we associate with, say, well, the Austrian school in economics, and all of that. So he was never really fully on board with, say, the Reagan revolution or anything along those lines, Barry Goldwater, et cetera. But he was more kind of old right, I guess you could say. He was kind of sort of oriented toward tradition. He thought tradition was tremendously important and provided kind of a structure within which a civilization can function. And he was a great advocate of the household and sort of family life, generally speaking, but particularly in its economic and practical roles that it plays in our world. So I have a great deal of affection for Christopher Lasch. The last book he wrote is a book entitled The Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy. And I think it came out in 1996 or 7. And I read it while I was at Harvard. So, it was one of those books. I was already into Lasch, and it was a lot of the things that he said in the book were things that I kind of already had already heard, before from him, and from other people. But it was a marvelously well-crafted book and prescient in so many ways. The world that Lasch describes in The Revolt of the Elites is the world that we live in today. He saw it all coming. And anyway, I'd like to react to a particular chapter in the book, the last chapter, the 13th chapter of the book. And the title of that book, or that chapter, is The Soul of Man Under Secularism. The Soul of Man Under Secularism. Now, Lasch, he doesn't give us any very clear indication that he's a Christian. In fact, I think one of the things that he said near the end of his life is that, let me paraphrase it, I'm a Jansenist without hope, meaning that, he had a kind of disposition that would be very, I guess, congenial to many of our Reformed listeners. He, by the way, praised Jonathan Edwards. He thought Jonathan Edwards was perhaps the greatest mind that our nation had ever produced. He quotes from Edwards' book on virtue in the Revolt of the Elites. But the title of the chapter, The Soul of Man Under Secularism, is itself a riff on something by Oscar Wilde, something he wrote entitled The Soul of Man Under Socialism. Anyway, I'd like to talk about the presentation that Lasch makes of Oscar Wilde's work, because I think with Wilde and his sort of his outlook and the things that he hoped that socialism could deliver, we see all around us today with a lot of young people. And so anyway, when you see the affection or the sort of I'm trying to get this is one of the bad things about Kindle. I mean, it goes off on you. So I had my Kindle on and to the section that I wanted. When you have just an old fashioned book, you just put it down and there's your book. But with Kindle, you get shut off. But anyway, that's that. So I don't know if you guys have any thoughts or, about Wilde, about Lasch, about this subject, but if you do, let's hear them before we jump into some really provocative stuff from Oscar Wilde through Christopher Lasch.
One thing to remember is that through the 19th century, when you talk about socialism, you're not necessarily talking about Marx.
Right.
So it is important to remember that there are a variety of schools of socialism out there in that period. And I'm not sure which one Wilde was or wasn't reacting to. So.
Right. Yeah. Well, you'll hear in a minute because,
and I know now, and I don't remember, because I know Wilde was had a bit of a process of change going on. He was, pretty obnoxious and perverted, and of course he was always flaunting himself in the rules. But on the other hand, he ended up having a profound kind of maybe a return to Catholicism. But I don't know at what phase, I don't remember at what phases all of these things took place. And I don't know where this would fall in relationship to kind of that line of things. But I know he was controversial all the way through.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So he was tried for indecency because of unnatural acts with men. So that gives you a sense of what the world was like at that time and what Wilde was like. But there is a belief among some people that Wilde had a deathbed conversion, and that's something that's been debated. And there are people who don't think that's what happened. There are other people who do believe that's what happened. But anyways, it's not unchallenged. I know that it's something that a lot of folks in our circles, are at least hopeful happened. But that's I think a good point that you brought out, that he was all over the place and at different points of his life, seemed to promote different things. And anyway, so I've got a few things I'd like to read here that I think give us plenty to talk about. So this is Lasch, and he's addressing the subject of socialism and Wilde. So here's what Lasch says. Socialism, as Wilde understood it, was simply another name in 1891 in the social circles in which Wilde was at home, a deliberately provocative name for the elimination of drudgery by machines. Wilde had no patience with those who proclaimed the dignity of labor. Quote, "There is nothing necessarily dignified about manual labor at all, and most of it is absolutely degrading." So we see a number of things going on here that are worth thinking about. One is this association with socialism and machines, and that kind of makes some sense in the sense that the Industrial Revolution is the sort of the ferment or the sort of the world in which socialism, communism, and so forth find their expression, and they're champions. But then there's this other dimension here, which is absolutely kind of the antithesis of what you hear from most socialists or Marxists, the contempt for manual labor. Now, this is something I think is worth kind of keeping in the back of our minds as we go forward here. Now, here's something else from Lasch talking about Wilde and his.
Well, hold on.
Sure.
Chris,
Yep.
Before you go on, I would like a definition of what he means by manual labor there.
Right.
If he's talking about going out and digging a ditch or something like that, that's one thing. If he's talking about handcrafting a pair of shoes, that's a different thing.
Yeah,
what exactly is he referring to?
Yeah, I can't say with complete certainty what he's talking about, but I think this next quote will help to, I think, resolve or at least give us a strong indication that he meant all the above. In other words, Wilde didn't have any sort of interest or sort of sympathy for anything that could be, I guess, remotely associated with the bourgeoisie or with traditional crafts or whatever. So here's the next quotation. This is again Lasch talking about Wilde. "If manual labor was degrading, property was a bore." You can almost kind of sense the tone, the accent, the dismissiveness, in which, in Wilde's opinion, quote, this is Wilde, "its duties make it unbearable." Now, here's the tongue-in-cheek with Wilde. "In the interest of the rich, we must get rid of it." In other words, the wealthy were the ones who owned property. He wanted to liberate them from the management of property because the management of property made them boring. So then he goes on, this is Lasch again. "No less than manual labor, the administration of property distracted people from the real business of life." And here's the real business of life according to Wilde: "the cultivation and the enjoyment of personality. Okay, just let that kind of sink in. So, you get where I'm going with this, right? So, David Brooks a few years ago wrote a book entitled, I guess something about the Bobos. You remember that one? The Bohemian bourgeoisie. This idea that, what we have, in our time is the coming together of, sort of, I guess, free expression and, sort of self-absorption with affluence and, kind of, neoliberalism and capitalism. These two things have come together. And when you go to a place like New York or San Francisco or, any of the, world-class cities where the creatives live, that's what you see. You see, this fusion of things that people, I guess, never before anticipated coming together. And I think that's kind of what we see here with Wilde. He celebrates socialism because he believes that the material needs, that we have are going to be satisfied through this sort of collectivist approach, so that we have the free time to all be artists, that kind of thing. Yeah. So anyway, here's Wilde talking about personality. So this is what he would like to see more of, and which I think we have plenty of today. So he says, quote, speaking of personality, it will grow naturally and simply, flower-like, whereas a tree grows. It will never argue or dispute. It will not always be meddling with others or asking them to be like itself. It will love them because they will be different. The personality of man will be very wonderful. It will be as wonderful as the personality of a child. Now, what I see in that is childishness. My own sense is that Wilde would like to just sort of have us all live lives as children in some kind of, finger painting class, where we're all kind of just putting ourselves on display for one another and appreciating all of the beauty that is on display, that is, sort of unaffected, very much in the spirit of the sort of the outlook that I think we've talked about before with, say, Rousseau, kind of a contempt for discipline, contempt for all that stuff.
You can hear definitely several elements coming together, and then remember some of the context of Wilde was, he was, if I remember, he was a Oxford, indulged Oxford student at a time of indulgence among Oxford students, when the academic side wasn't the side that was emphasized. Although, to their credit, they tended to be pretty well read and good writers. I mean, they had that context going for them, at least in terms of not necessarily reading what they have as good, but they could write. But here you have on the one hand this kind of this romanticism that's still flowering in the air, which was really big around that time in that environment. Of you have sort of a developmental understanding or organic understanding of life. Then you have this kind of childlike simplicity as the kind of the ideal, right? Before it's corrupted by something else. There's your Rousseau, and then you have it kind of tied to a kind of egocentrism that is about one's self-expression and one's own personality. So cult of personality starts to become something that grows out of this. So you have all this stuff that really doesn't cohere well. And then here, this is kind of put in the middle of a socialism that could never sustain itself with a bunch of that kind of product.
Right.
And it also strikes me, to go back to Lasch's first major book, it strikes me that what he wants is a culture of narcissism.
Yeah.
He is narcissistic himself. And he wants everybody to be like him, which will not only affirm him, but will also keep him infinitely amused.
Yeah. I think that's it. Yeah.
It strikes me as just being incredibly effete and narcissistic, all kinds of other things.
Right.
And
right.
The idea here that everybody would be happy in that kind of a situation, that there aren't people who genuinely enjoy working with their hands, is silly. The idea that you could have a world so economically productive that everybody could live without working is, on the face of it, absurd.
Right. I guess, one of the things we could say is obviously he's a member of a social class, and he's pretty blind to what of people outside that class. And that's one of the things that Lasch, states, in that first quotation that I read, that, for Wilde, what he's describing is essentially, sort of this fantasy land that he's comfortable living in. And he's not really, I guess, capable of appreciating the very things that you just brought up, Glenn. I think there is a kind of parallel in our time. We've talked about what Carl Trueman has presented to us in that great book that he just published not too long ago, The Triumph of the Modern Self. And I think we see some of this, I guess, maybe an embryo, in the late 19th century. I was thinking about this. Who's the original hippie? Is it Thoreau? Is it, Walt Whitman? Is it, Oscar Wilde? Who is or is it Rousseau? Who is the original hippie? And then
I vote Rousseau.
Right.
Of course, I vote Rousseau for just about everything.
Everything dark and sinister.
Who's the one who actually took Rousseau, the painter, Gauguin, right? Who took Rousseau so seriously that he went for a small period of time to go live with the quote unquote noble savage and ended up leaving very quickly.
That's right. Yeah, it wasn't so noble; it was more savage. So, I remember when I lived in Cambridge, we had, an environment in which everybody had the pretense of being an artist. In fact, we had kind of the Walmart of art stores there. It's one of these things. You think about Walmart where you get all of the things that you need for, I guess, your home and your yard cheap. And the reason you can have things as inexpensively as you have in Walmart is just because of the volume that they're able to work with, and consequently they bring down prices. Generally speaking, when it comes to art supplies, stuff like that, brushes, paints, etc., you're dealing with some pretty sort of specialty sort of shops that provide those goods, and they tend to be pricey. But when I lived there in the 90s, we saw this sort of superstore open in Central Square, where you could get your brushes in bulk, all this kind of stuff. And it really was the right place to open a shop like that, because everybody thought he or she was an artist, and quality of the art that they produced was pretty low. I mean, when you democratize art, which you actually end up doing, is not sort of you don't see everybody become Rodin or like Da Vinci or anything like that. Basically, what you see is just a lot of people who maybe really are just advanced finger painters doing artsy things, and that's what you have in a situation like that. But the self-understanding, though, that I am an artist carries over into what Carl talks about, and what actually Lasch talks about here, in the sense that the canvas is not just simply this object outside of yourself that you paint on. You are the canvas. Wilde thought of himself as the canvas. Many of these people think of themselves as the canvas. I am working on me, sort of my sort of expressing myself, sort of making my statement, what have you. But I'm the art. And I think that's really what, Wilde is addressing when he talks about personality. He's talking about the person as the art. Anyway.
Yeah.
So
here's something I think it has an appeal again. Mm-hmm. I was going to say, I think it has an appeal to the adolescent mind. I mean, I remember when my oldest was a teen, and I remember him coming in one day and going through all that, need for attention, saying, I want to be a walking piece of art, and I knew exactly where that was coming from. But it's just interesting that this, most people grow out of it as he did, whereas this was considered a life end for these people.
Right. And I remember, the 60s. I was alive in those days, and we actually had hippies who roomed in our house, and I just have all this stuff kind of in the back of my mind when I think about the 60s. But the connection between an agitator, sort of political agitator, and an artist is something that Wilde perceived, but I think also is brought to the surface here, by Lasch in a great way in this chapter. Let me just read you another portion here, and it gives us something more to think about. So, speaking of agitators, political agitators, Lasch says they shared with artists a hatred of authority, a contempt for tradition, and refusal to court popular favor. Agitators and artists were the supreme embodiment of individualism. Wishing only to please themselves, they took no notice whatever of the public, nor did they pay the slightest attention to this, quote, sickly cant about doing what other people want because they want it, or any hideous cant about self-sacrifice. So it's really, clearly about the self and the sort of the collision, or maybe the collusion, that's a better way to put it, the collusion of political agitators with artists is something that goes back maybe further than we appreciate or seem to have a sense for. But anyway, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, my first inclination when you read the quote from Wilde is that he seemed singularly unaware, in some sense, of what art really is. It strikes me that he sort of trivialized it as just being about personality and all of that kind of thing, which is a very modern way of thinking about art. And I think Lasch is sort of picking up on that in the direction he's going with this. It seems to me that art, if it's going to have any kind of meaning at all, I mean, I've struggled with this, trying to work out a definition of art in my own mind. And at the moment, at least, I've concluded it is something like a method of communication that doesn't use normal discourse, that doesn't lay things out and explain them. And so art is meant to actually say something. It's meant to actually communicate something, but it doesn't do it in an explicit laid out way. I mean, that's more or less where my thinking is on this. And it connects as well to beauty and all of those kinds of things, which are things that Wilde would just simply ignore in favor, I think, of something that he would find shocking or titillating or amusing or something like that. It really trivializes the entire conception of art, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think you're right in the sense that I think Wilde is a kind of forerunner of the cult of personality that we kind of see in the art world today. Today artists are all about self-expression. They're not interested in communicating truths or beauty or anything that has some kind of transcendent character, anything that could be universal. I think maybe the last stand of universalism was abstraction. But what you have now is that. But he in the Romantic period, there was still, he still has some, I think, aspiration to communicate the beautiful. But you can see that it's mingled with this other kind of thing, the personality, that I think is eclipsing that. So he's, I think, a kind of a transitional figure in that respect. But you're definitely right. This is what we have today, and this is what you can see in embryo with Wilde. Is like when you think about today, I think one of the reasons why poetry is so, I guess, sort of dismissed as, people no longer see its significance, is because poets in the past believed they were communicating truths that could only be accessed through poetry. They weren't theaters for your personality or your political sort of, I guess, sort of anger or frustrations, like they are today. It's like, poetry is all about rage or about some kind of weird sort of thing that you're doing to sort of talk about some aspect of your inner world or life that's transgressive and needs to get out and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it lacks, there's a lot of ways you can go here, but I mean, the way in which poetry, for example, has been very reduced to, rather than the wider earlier concepts, or the old literary approach to art or poetry or anything else was the ancients, of course, the old mimesis, and then later poiesis, the poetic. And I think Truman actually applies this to the self-understanding of the human later. And that's sort of what you have going on, where older forms of art aim to imitate, if you will, reality in some way. And so for a human being to correspond with that larger reality vision, to imitate it, their place in it, that was considered being good art, and being truthfully enacting what one is. Whereas later, as that kind of breaks down, and then it becomes more focused on the expressive and the constructive, and that changes all of that. And I think what you see with Wilde is that starting to take on a familiar form to us now.
Yeah, in fact, what we have with Wilde, and Lasch gets into this, is even the sort of reconstrual of the theological enterprise in the, I guess, image of the artist. So let me read you another passage here from Lasch in which he's drawing on Wilde, and you'll see what I'm getting at. So Lasch says, all the great leaders in history, according to Wilde, had the artistic temperament. Jesus Christ himself was an artist with an artist's message to the world. Quote, he said to man, you have a wonderful personality. Develop it. Be yourself. End of quote. That was Wilde. Wilde. He's quoting Wilde there. In his De Profundis, a long letter to Lord Alfred Douglas, written 6 years later from the depths of his imprisonment in Reading Gaol, Wilde amplified this interpretation of, quote, Christ as the precursor of the Romantic movement in life, end of quote, and the, quote, most supreme of individualists, end of quote, having, quote, created himself, end of quote, out of his, quote, his own imagination, end of quote. Jesus of Nazareth preached the power of imagination as the, quote, basis of all spiritual and material life, end of quote, according to Wilde. He preached imaginative sympathy, not altruism, but his own powers of sympathetic identification made him the mouthpiece of the entire world of the inarticulate, the voiceless world of pain. His life, as recorded in the Gospels, was just like a work of art. He belonged with the poets, and his chief war was against the Philistines, not the Pharisees, the Philistines. The war that every child of light has to wage, end of quote. There were sprinkled through that, by the way, a lot of different quotations. I just thought it was getting a little bit much for me to say, quote, end of quote all the time. But there was a lot of stuff drawn directly from Wilde there. So let me go back and just finish this reading. Even in the depths of his own public degradation and despair, Wilde saw no reason to modify what he had written in The Soul of Man Under Socialism, that he who would lead a Christ-like life must be entirely and absolutely himself, as he put it in his earlier text. The message of Christ to man was simply, be thyself. That is the message of Christ, according to Wilde, that is. So anyway, again, more quotes sprinkled throughout that reading. But everything that sounds, cloying, that was Wilde. And anyway, go ahead, Glenn.
It almost reminds me of some of the stuff you get from people like Harvey Cox.
I knew Harvey, by the way.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, but Harvey Cox, it's almost the Jesus is hippie that you get in Godspell, things like that.
Yeah,
I mean,
right,
he'd have fit right in there.
Yeah, he really would have. And when you see pictures of Wilde, I mean, he just comes across as just, I mean, the aesthete on steroids, but maybe steroids isn't the right word. But you get my point.
Well,
I mean, he's
over the top. On mushrooms.
Yeah, I'd say he's over the top.
There's an interesting thing that he has going on there, though. And I mean, I think on the one hand, being at a time that has now pretty much removed from a lot of the romantic context, I do appreciate his interest in imagination and his interest in some of these things that has now been wrong. But it's the governing metaphysic that's the problem here. Notice what he says. He says, the issue, the command is basically not know thyself, right? Be thyself. But for him, being what you are, is not, as the Gospels teach and then the epistles teach, that who you are now in Christ, right? I mean, that's what the gospel is. Be who you are truly in Christ. There's the imitative, and then there is the participatory going on, and then there's everything tied up with Christ's person and work. But what's going on here is that I mean, the New Testament is talking about the proper ends for which we are to orient ourselves to truly be who we now are because of Christ and his work. What Wilde has going on here is he is defining the ends for himself. And the ends are his sort of imaginatively construed self-definition, ungoverned by any larger reality or any Christ-likeness. And so you have, under all his revisionist theology there, a revisionist view of what it means to be human and what human purposes are.
Yeah. I'm sure that you guys have friends. Maybe friends is not the term. Acquaintances, family members who really are sort of embodiments of this way of thinking that we see on display with Wilde. If I were to show people in Pugcast land photographs of my extended family, they would just be astounded because they just live out this stuff all the time. And, I think one of the challenges that we have is, how do we reach these people? I mean, Wilde is kind of I think a forerunner, but he's multiplied. We have these people all around us today. And it's a challenge to, I think, just the practical matter of how do we connect with these people in a way that doesn't fuel their insanity, because even when you bring up matters related to the spirit and truth, it's being filtered through a way of thinking that sort of works everything in a way that actually reinforces the very thing you're trying to undermine. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. It sounds like Wilde is saying that the chief end of man is to glorify man and enjoy him forever.
Yeah.
I think
that's right.
So the question is, how, again, that's the narcissism coming out. How do you break through to that? How do you break through that?
Right. Now, getting back to this whole matter of socialism, socialists, of course, love to march, and demonstrate on behalf of the oppressed. And the oppressed could be, the working class, although you don't see that much anymore. or some, I guess, ethnic group, or some, sort of sexual minority, or what have you.
Today, the oppressed is the microaggressed. I mean, that's pretty much
right.
The microaggressed. Right. It's not anyone genuinely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but what you see going on, when you agree, Tom and Glenn, is that somehow these folks have been able to, I guess, harmonize or synergize that with their own self-expression. So in a weird way, social concerns are the same thing as sort of the celebration of personality. These things kind of come together in a way.
Well, I think that was the evil genius behind this new variant of socialism or Marxism or whatever, is that it was able to wed those two things together, the kind of egocentric and self-expressive with the political, and the personal and the political. Sorry, Glenn, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, that's quite all right. The personal is the political is the slogan of the old feminists.
Right.
And in the current version of identity politics, your identity is determined by your intersectional categories. That is to say, the particular set of approved oppressions that you fall under or don't. Mm-hmm. And that really defines everything that there is about you. The weird thing is that within the world of critical theory, you don't exist really as an autonomous, independent agent. All you are is a representative of your various groups, and everything about you is determined by that, which means that the personal isn't really personal in a big way. What it really is just simply intersectional. And then that turns it political. So it's kind of a weird thing, but I do agree with you that it is such an incoherent way of seeing the world that nobody really lives that way, with the net result that they merge their own particular self-identity, self-concept of who they are and all of that into a political agenda that's ultimately rooted not in aesthetics or beauty or personality or anything like that, but in the raw exercise of power.
Yeah, I think that you have that definitely with sort of the hardcore intersectional folks. But I think that there is a kind of penumbra, this sort of thing that surrounds this, where you have the beautiful people for whom these causes are kind of like accessories, like a Gucci purse or something, or like a fancy dog, and they sort of they put these things on to sort of I guess enhance their appeal, their sort of, and as means of expression. And if you challenge them at all, if you say, that's not really you, or that is not really true, it doesn't really matter, because it's not necessarily intended to serve that purpose. It's more or less something that is intended to be, like I said, an accessory, something you carry around with you. Now,
you have this. Mm-hmm. I was going to say, you have this way in which the accidental, to use old language, the accidental becomes considered essential because we're considered not to have anything essential about us. So we're defined now by those things that aren't essential to us. And then we try to make them that. That's why they're so fragile, by the way, because and that's why they need social control to hold that fragile identity in place, because those things aren't essential. That's something that has to be basically controlled in order to sustain that kind of self-definition or anything else. I mean, think of it another way. Even when we talk about the issue, for example, of everything now in relationship to who has more power, right? Social power, who has more privilege, which equates to power. I mean, notice what they do is, so you're now defined basically by you're defined by your relationship to power. And so what they've done is taken a creaturely magnitude, which is creaturely power, and made that the ultimate determination of our natures and everything we are. And see, this is the big hole in all of this, because it is not. It's the infinite source who governs and gives all things, God the Creator, that is the primary a determiner of the fact that we are and what we are and the ends for which we have. And so it's our relationship to those, not power, that determines our character, our nature, and everything else. So you could have all these privileges, but doesn't mean you're abusing others. You could actually bearing fruit in a Christ-like way that are serving many people. And so this is something that they really have flawed right at the heart. But I think this taking a creaturely magnitude and making it the core place of defining ourselves, what we are and what we're here for, is in all of these variations.
Yeah. I still would like to kind of comb out a little bit this distinction between, say, the true believers in kind of intersectionality from the, fellow travelers or the artistes who the aesthetes, who are aligned with them. And I'm kind of more interested today in kind of focusing in on the aesthetes, because frankly, that's kind of the world that I'm coming out of in terms of my own personal family background. And there are a few other things that Lasch has to say about this whole matter that I think are helpful, particularly when we think about this particular group of people, because the people I have in mind, they vote correctly, quote correctly, for all the right causes, but they really are not true believers. They're just simply, sort of on the bandwagon, just saying, "Hey, me too," and to use that "me too" expression in a different way. But yeah, me too. Mm-hmm. So here's something else from Lasch. Quote, "In the heyday of the socialist movement, its attraction for intellectuals cannot be adequately explained without considering the way it overlapped with the bohemian critique of the bourgeoisie. Socialists and aesthetes shared a common enemy, the bourgeois Philistine, and the unremitting onslaught against bourgeois culture was far more lasting in its effects, in the West at least, and now probably in the East as well, than the attack on capitalism." I think that is so right on. And this is why David Brooks can actually write a book today, called, Bobos in Paradise. That was the title, if I recall correctly, about sort of the wedding of the bourgeoisie with the bohemian, because now the bourgeoisie are themselves, sort of putting on airs. They want to distance themselves from this kind of contempt that was so common among socialists and aesthetes back in the day. Now, this would be a good time to talk a little bit about who are the bourgeoisie. What are we talking about when we refer to someone as a Philistine? A lot of our listeners will say, Philistines, aren't they in the Bible? Aren't we talking about people in the Old Testament? No, a Philistine is a person who has no artistic sense. A person who, maybe another word that people would be familiar with that sometimes is used for Philistine is kitsch. This sort of like cheap sort of plastic mass-produced art. It appeals to this sort of just unsophisticated sentimentality. It's the kind of thing you see like maybe with I don't know. Those little figurines, that women liked so much here. Was it? I can't remember the name of the line, but anyway, I think you get my drift. There's a kind of precious moments. You remember those little figurines, precious moments? So people who like that kind of stuff are Philistines. They're people who like cheap and sort of mass-produced, sentimentally sort of hyped or overloaded things that grandmas like. If you get my drift. I don't mean to be too hard on grandmas, but in fact, my grandmothers wouldn't have fit that profile at all. But so this sort of thing is in view. And the bourgeois, are people who, adhere to a set of moral restrictions that are intended to, I guess, make them productive and respectable. in a capitalist society. So, the ability to defer gratification, the ability to work hard and be on time, all of these things, bathe, all these things are bourgeois values. And if you are, a bohemian or a socialist, you don't bathe, you don't show up on time, you get my drift, because you feel contempt, or you're at least communicating or conveying contempt for those values, which many, bohemians and aesthetes believed were, sort of serving an oppressive kind of social regime. Anyway, just to kind of give our folks a little bit of background on that stuff.
Yeah, and the irony of this is that the Bohemian revolt against, or the socialist revolt against bourgeois values has won.
Yeah.
I mean, it is really, it dominates the mainstream media, it dominates Hollywood. It's important in our political discourse, all of these kinds of things, and yet they still act as if they're in a war against these values of this oppressive culture that is dominating everything, when in fact they're the ones who actually hold all the cultural power.
Right.
Yeah. They're completely unaware, it seems, of that. And I think what ends up happening, I'm reading a book called Woke Capitalism, really interesting book, in which it's arguing that that businesses that go woke do it because of a couple of reasons, not the least of which is to insulate them from criticism from their other practices, because they're now fellow travelers with the people who are doing the protests and all of that kind of thing. It's a cynical move on the part of businesses. On the part of your artistes, I don't think it's quite as cynical, but I think it's just as self-serving ultimately in terms of the entire program. Because by identifying with these progressive causes and all of that, it enhances their reputation, it makes them more popular, it gets them attention, it gets them airplay, all of these kinds of things that feed into their ego, which is really ultimately what it's about.
Right. And I think the exasperation that many people feel, particularly people who are working class or maybe just have strong patriotic sentiments, they can see all of the stuff that you just described, Glenn. They can see the hypocrisy, and they don't have any voice. But the more that they, I guess, express what voice that they have, they're actually that voice is taken and in a strange way through this ideological lens, this kind of bohemian sort of frame of reference. They are painted as the oppressors, as you've noted, when in fact they have almost no control even over their daily livelihoods anymore, because they work for large woke corporations that could fire them, if somebody in HR sees a post on Facebook that is unapproved or calls into question the values of wokeness, if you get my drift. So yeah, we find ourselves in this really odd spot of the people who are oppressed, who don't have a voice, are the people who are said to be the oppressors and are the ones who are said to be controlling, speech.
Yeah, the ones that don't have time for leisure, because most of them are trying to work and feed families and all of that, which is all seen as corrupt values, having families that you have to feed. It's read with all this distortive arrogance, often moral superiority, when really the alternatives that are offered are not livable in the long haul, and most of them don't live like that. They just castigate others for not doing it. But it is a strange, again, it's kind of a point I was making earlier. It is a strange evil cocktail, if you will, that has allowed a society not just one. I mean, the West in particular, and spreading, to be so ready for this kind of incoherent view of things. I mean, you really have. I mean, you talk about classic definitions of what is false as being that which isn't. This is one of those examples. This is a lie. This isn't reality, and it's a sheer falsehood. And I don't think it has the capacity, just like other variations of it, of sustaining itself endlessly. We don't know when. We don't know how long. It will do a lot of damage. But anything not built enough in relationship to reality will form cracks, and those cracks will widen. And the question is, what's the consequence then? And I think we've raised that question in other episodes. The possibilities. Yeah. But that's what you have. You're created. This situation is being created continuously, where you're starting to literally call black, white, white, black, truth, false, false, truth. And it's got to be doing destructive things to right. Just everyone's common way of referring and understanding anything.
Or you end up with a situation that I've seen many times, kind of closet bourgeoisie and sort of public bohemianism. So, we've known people like this where, they're known publicly as standing for a particular set of, I guess, bohemian values, but then you actually go to, visit them in their homes, and they are about as bourgeois as you could possibly imagine, even down to traditional sex roles. I mean, it's just, it's full of inconsistencies and hypocrisy. Anyway, we should probably begin to wrap things up here. Believe it or not, we're kind of getting to that time. I could say that you want to say something, though, Glenn.
I'm actually kind of intrigued by people who fall in the opposite direction, not the ones who are public bohemians, but private bourgeois, but people who live very conventional lives in a lot of ways, but who end up going off in other directions in their private life. I'm thinking about, people who do LARPing, or even to some extent escaping into video games. But I'm thinking less of that than some of these people who will become neo-pagans, or something like that, as a way of sort of breaking out of what they perceive as the constraints that are on their lives and their behavior in public. Mm-hmm. That's something I'm probably going to be exploring a bit when I do. I'm doing a conference on Tolkien in early October in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and that'll be one of the topics that I've been thinking a lot about that because of that conference. Yeah, different ways of escaping the sort of ruts that we get into in our daily lives. Tolkien thought escape was a good thing.
Right.
But I think that we can say that there are good and bad ways of escape.
Right.
And some of I know people who have very conventional jobs and families and things like that, who just sort of go completely in kind of wild directions when they have time in their private life.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the flip side of this, I think.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think it has something to do with some of the ways that we think about freedom today. We don't think of freedom as having sort of a truthful expression, just a self-expression. When Christ says, the truth will make you free, a lot of folks, I think, feel that's a non sequitur. I mean, if something is true, I mean, in the sense that it stands outside of me, then it somehow binds me and keeps me from being what I want to be. And maybe that's another subject for another day. But I think it's interesting that there are these two different ways kind of dealing with the bohemian, the bourgeois, and flipping them back and forth between these two groups. Anyway, anything you want to say as we wrap up, Tom?
No, I think I said enough.
All right. Well, we really do appreciate your interest in the Theology Pugcast. And by the way, we are in the final stages of finalizing our tour of the Pacific Northwest. We're going to be in the Portland area on the 30th and 31st of October. We're going to be up in the Seattle area on the 2nd and 3rd. And we're going to be in Moscow on the 4th, Moscow, Idaho on the 4th and 5th. And when all of the details are worked out and the locations are finalized and the times are set, we will post all of that stuff on our website. And you'll be able to be a part of those events. We're looking forward to doing some live shows like we did at the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network. That was a lot of fun, by the way, and we'd love to do that again. And we're also in the process of getting all of our merch made because we've got a lot of folks who have expressed interest in buying our pint glasses and our T-shirts and our hideous Cerberus pugs with our 3 heads on them. Anyway, thank you for listening to the Theology Pugcast. We really do appreciate your interest and support. Bye-bye.